Andrea Brown earned a Bachelor's of Science degree with honors in psychology from Otterbein College, a Master's of Education and PhD in Counseling Psychology from Arizona State University, where she was a preparing future faculty fellow. Her clinical training and professional experiences include school, community, and college counseling center settings. Dr. Brown's scholarly interests include academic persistence, culture, women's issues and religion, spirituality, and mental health. She serves as a faculty advisor to the Psychology Club and is a 2010-2011 recipient of the Center for Teaching and Learning Full-Time Faculty Fellowship.
Okay. Good evening. I'm gonna pull the PowerPoint up here. And okay. I had an interesting experience. I loved my Smithsonian experience. I applied to the fellowship because I always enjoyed going to museums and taking art history and those sorts of things. And my education was liberal, and we were really encouraged to think critically but make connections across topics that sometimes don't even seem relatable. And that actually worked to my advantage this semester. I gave my students liberty to choose the museum that they wanted to attend, but I hoped that they would pick some of the ones that I had in mind, and they shocked me by choosing in a psychology course to go to the David H. Cox Hall of Human Origins exhibit. But I had ideas for how we could use this, so hopefully you'll see how that went. So this is a course that I applied the fellowship to. I plan in the future to apply it also to psychology of women. But in the cultural psychology class, you can see that we are interested in looking at everything from development, cognition, that is how we think, mental processes, personality, and then finally the last two things I have in that description are social behavior and social institutions. So a lot of times we're dealing with things like media or schools and that, but this time I was able to expand what social institution was in my class by including museums. Okay, these are some selected course objectives. Obviously, I want my students to think critically about issues, research, not to just read everything that they see. And actually, I like them to think so hard that their brains hurt. So we actually had to do some of that in trying to continually tie in this topic with our course. So I want them to apply the course material to their life, current events, etc., and then just understand in that last bullet how culture influences behavior, worldview, group relations, and our mental life. Here are some of my students. That's me right there, and three of our students. It was a small class, and we went 2 days in a row. Here's another group of students. We had about 12 in our class, so we went 2 different days, and some students chose to go on their own. So the students voted, as I said, for the Museum of Natural History. I provided them with links for all the museums, encouraged them to go and do their own research and figure out which ones would you really get the most out of. And they shocked me. They picked the National Museum of Natural History. So I did my homework, and I tried to think about how we can make this connection between science and evolution and that, and what we were doing, what our topic was. So naturally, some of the things that we've had in common as human beings that are included in that exhibit are human beings have always had a social life, language, and symbols. Human change always occurs through evolution. And finally, race and skin color is something that's indirectly addressed there through some of the video footage. I instructed my students to kind of take their time and look throughout the exhibit, but also I had some prescriptive things for them, and one was to watch the One Species Living Worldwide video that they have there, which shows us how we began in Africa and then have since migrated throughout the world. These were all done in an effort to kind of eventually make this connection to race, and that it is something that we as human beings have created and come up with. So. The students were also responsible for discussion boards, and you'll see some of those questions in just a second, and some interesting student responses. And then our final exam, they had a reflection question where I asked them how an exhibit of this nature could actually be helpful in helping us to work towards becoming a more post-racial society, or to have better racial relations. So they had some interesting ideas about that. Throughout the semester, we discussed various topics, and among those, obviously, are race, but this time it was helpful having the Smithsonian because it puts the race talk into context. A lot of times people, given their definition of culture, they sometimes don't include race, but I think that depending on where you're from, race has to be included in your definition of culture. So we differentiated between race and ethnicity. This bullet that says cultural wars, I talk about that in different ways. There are things within our society where people are split down the middle. I mean, ranging from, oh gosh, everything from sex education to, as you can see, evolution. Some people believe we should not be talking about that. We should homeschool our children and so on and so forth. Also things like global warming. In any event, going into that, to this exhibit, it puts a lot of those things into perspective. And I think for some of the students who have problems making the abstract more concrete, having an exhibit like this and allowing them to watch the videos and see scientifically how we've evolved into being a human, they had a better sense of why some people may have a problem with things like evolution. So that's where, again, one of our psychology objectives was fulfilled. We ended up discussing religion inadvertently because it feeds into some of the cultural wars around whether or not to believe in things like evolution or global warming, prejudice, discrimination, and such. Cultural competence is a bullet that I have there because it was important for my students when they leave to at least have examine their own feelings and values around hot topics that aren't always pleasant but are culturally psychology related. And then I wanted them to gain knowledge and skills and be able to apply them in the real world. So you can read the rest. Skin color, again, was somehow addressed in that exhibit as well. All right, here are some of the selected course resources that I used in addition to the museum. My students had access to the Hall of Human Origins website. I provided them with an article that we actually read as a cohort called Museums and Race Living Up to the Public Trust, just to get them introduced into thinking about how race could even fit into museums. This is an interesting resource, the immigration tracker here. My students had fun playing with that just as we see the sort of immigration trends into this country and where people sort of went and spread. And they were able to make connections to just that human tendency to migrate and move and change. Additionally, we used some examples from a site called Multiracial in America. It's MSNBC sponsored, but it has different clips of people who consider themselves multiracial in America. In other words, what does that mean? Race is, again, this social construct. An interesting assignment that they had around how they felt about race that got at prejudice and discrimination and such was this Project Implicit, which is a project from Harvard, longstanding, that gets at designed to assess our unconscious biases. So you'll have people saying one thing but doing another. So there's a set of tests that you can go on and assess oneself. So they were always encouraged to do these things and then also come back and talk about that. Additionally, I used portions of Faces of America because many of my students say, well, we don't have a race. And I wanted them to see, well, if you're Irish, then you need to understand how Irish people were viewed when they came to America. And so there were different portraits of famous Americans who were talking about their ethnicity. And that helped my students to make a connection between them having some sort of ethnicity or race other than being just purely American. Class Divided was one that I used to illustrate prejudice in that. And then one of the more recent replications of the classic doll study where we say which one is the good doll. So those are just things that I used throughout the course that got at race and biases and these sorts of things. Here's one of the discussion board questions that I posed to my class, and this was probably towards the middle of the semester, but I asked them, did they believe that the U.S. is poised to be post-racial, is currently post-racial, or something together, something else altogether. And so here's a quote, but I don't have to read all of it, but for the most part, all of my students agreed, there was consensus that we aren't in a post-racial society. And they were arriving at these conclusions based on all of the work that we had done, their own personal experiences and those sorts of things. And so that's just a sample there. Other reflection board questions related to the fellowship included racial and ethnic social models. I wanted them to think about how these could be helpful for understanding each other in a multicultural society, which ones were most helpful that we discussed in our class. And then one day, if we are indeed to be post-racial and evolve, will this even be necessary? Very similar to Professor Smith's question, I think. A student agreed that what we were doing was helpful. They thought that the models that we presented in cultural psychology were good for helping to understand other people and maybe reduce prejudice and stereotyping. The student particularly believes that early education, I don't think just cultural psychology, but I think in multicultural society will help us to eradicate some of those things. All right, moving on. Just a photo of an exhibit, a picture I took at the Hall of Human Origins that summarized our benefits and costs of being, human. Okay, and there are always going to be those sacrifices and gains. So one of the things that my students were encouraged to think about is that humans over the course of time have always cooperated in order to progress. And so I wanted them to think a little bit about that. Here's their final question. How could we use an exhibit like this to help people to rethink what they believe race is? And one important student quote was that if more people were exposed to the Hall of Human Origins, I think they would be more open to different cultures and more likely to focus on similarities and learn to respect differences. We could just realize that we all came from the same place and that we are human. So moving on, another picture, beyond Africa. We started there and we have moved beyond. And here are some teaching and learning outcomes. One of the major ones is that I did add evolution into my discussion in psychology. It really is an important topic, as it tells us a lot about people's worldview. That is the lens that they see the world. Do they believe in this or not? What are their values? So using this particular exhibit, we were able, again, to kind of make that this evolutionary debate a little bit more concrete. I did introduce new materials that were provided to us throughout the fellowship. And then for me as a teacher, the most exciting thing was that I was sort of engaged in this informal action research. That is, I didn't think my students were going to pick this museum. So everything was sort of about trial and error and tweaking and being very organic with what was happening and letting them sort of take the initiative in their learning. I think by and large, my students' view of culture was expanded, and they did understand that race is social construct. Finally, I plan to use this in all of my classes in the future, mostly the culture and gender-based ones. Continuing to integrate the web-based resources. I know for psychology of women, there are great resources about women in history that I plan to use there. And also just making good use out of all the faculty connections that I made this fellowship. Thank you.
Oh. And is our audience ready with a challenge question or comment for our speaker? All right, we've got one question.
Yes, Andrea spoke about hot topics in the beginning of our semester, and I really am very interested in the work that you have been doing on it, and I hope that campus and college-wide you help guide us. Many of us get together because we should be discussing hot topics in the classroom.
And I thank you for your comment, because I was deeply embedded in this all semester with teaching this class in the fellowship, and it did come to college-wide attention about discussing things that we need to educate our students about, and we need to kind of be comfortable in that and not want to shy away from it. So it has been emotionally and a little bit psychologically taxing, but I believe in it. I think that people should leave enlightened, so thank you.